into the respiratory medicine and allergy, and that probably is the perfect person to understand the needs of which are the right patients who should be needing immunotherapy and not. Sir Graham Roberts.
So good afternoon, everyone. This is also a first for me, doing a presentation via the internet. So I'm going to talk about one of my passions, immunotherapy. This is niche in terms of allergic asthma, but actually I think for some patients this is actually very relevant and very helpful. So I thought I'd first of all start off with a vote. I'm not sure I've seen anybody else do this yet. Hopefully it will work. This will just tell me if you've all gone off for lunch and if I've only actually talking to 10 people now.
Professor Roberts, we can do that. There's two things. The first one is at the moment we can see your presenter view. So we can see so rather than the full slide, we're seeing the next slide on the right and current slide. So, but I think actually you can switch it where your mouse is. If you move to display settings at the top, I believe you can flip the display. Swap presenter and slide show view. Right, now we've got full screen. The other thing though is I haven't been prepared for this. I don't remember receiving your poll. So we can do this question. That's not a problem. It will take me just a couple of minutes.
We'll do it at the end.
Okay.
Okay, well, that's fine. I had the same question at the beginning and the end, but we'll do it at the end. Okay, so moving on. So conflicts of interest. So I've got a couple of conflicts of interest I just need to flag up. I'm CI for a commercial trial looking at immunotherapy for asthma. I coordinated the ACI Allergen immunotherapy guidelines, and I'm also part of the UK SIGN BTS asthma guideline group. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk initially about the EACI, the European guidelines, as a way of actually getting into this topic. Then I want to just talk about some of the other guidelines, and then just think about what the challenges are in interpreting the evidence, because there are challenges. And then I'm going to tell you how I use allergen immunotherapy in my allergy and respiratory practice. So what is immunotherapy? So those who don't know, immunotherapy is essentially a way of actually deviating the immune response. So as you know, I'm an epidemiologist, not an immunologist, but essentially what you're doing is usually using increasing doses of allergen, or in the more modern preparation, just one dose of allergen, to deviate the immune system back towards the Th2 response, so back towards the Th1 response from the Th2 response you normally see in allergic disorders. And there's a whole load of publications you can read about this in the literature, particularly from Steve Durham's group at Imperial. So there's two approaches. There's the old-fashioned approach, which I started using 25 years ago, where we used injections, either a series of monthly injections, usually over a few years, or now there's another approach where you use adjuvants and allergoids and just have 4 injections pre-grass pollen season. And then there's a more modern approach where people are using drops or tablets under the tongue, so sublingular, and there are advantages and disadvantages of both, which will become apparent. I need to flag up, and I will flag this up a number of times, so actually only some products have got European Medicine Authority approval. We are still vaguely part of Europe. And more importantly, there's only evidence to support efficacy for some products, and I will come back to that. So the European guidelines. So we set about developing these about 5 years ago. We started anyway, published a couple of years ago. And I'm going to present 2 studies which just illustrate the data as they are. This is an adult study. It's an adult study because there are no pediatric data for the house dust mite tablet. It's a sublingual preparation. They included over 800 adults in this, and the key thing is they weren't controlled by inhaled corticosteroids with or without LABA. They had preserved lung function, and the endpoint was exacerbations. And there were 2 active groups, so 2 different dosages, because I couldn't decide which one was the best. And both active groups with sublingual immunotherapy to house dust mite did better than placebo, and about 10% reduction in exacerbations. There were no severe systemic allergic reactions, but interestingly, no improvement in asthma control nor quality of life. So that's the new study published a couple of years ago in JAMA. Then I want to just to show you an older study, one of my studies, which actually just nicely contrasts how asthma trials have changed in immunotherapy and actually another form of interventions over the last couple of decades. So this we published in 2006, smaller trial, only 39 children. They all had summer asthma. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean that it was asthma that was predominantly in the summer season, driven by grass pollen, and of course they had hay fever symptoms associated with it. And we used a cluster subcutaneous immunotherapy, and our endpoint was symptom medication score, as was people were using at that time. So the green on the figure is the pollen season. The dotted line is the interventional group, and the solid line is a placebo group. So we roughly halved symptom and medication use. And there were similar reductions in end organ reactivity to the allergen. So over the 2 years, you actually needed less grass pollen to induce bronchial constriction in the placebo group. In the active group, you needed more, and about 3 times as much. So there was end organ reduction in reactivity to the allergen, and similar systemic pulmonary side effects in both active and placebo groups, and none were severe. So very safe treatment and worked very well in that particular group. So as part of the YACI task force, we systematically reviewed the data in sort of the usual way, usual Cochrane type way. Nearly 100 publications looking at the use of immunotherapy for asthma. And these were summarized with forest plots. So looking at subcutaneous immunotherapy, that works in terms of the forest plot, and sublingular, that would also seem to work, with reduction in both symptom scores and medication scores. The thing to just highlight here is there was some evidence of publication bias, with small positive studies being published, and there weren't an equal number of small negative studies. So what about children and adults? Splitting them up, yes, it does work for both individually. The effect size may well be smaller for children, though, just looking at the forest plots. But those of you who are used to looking at systematic reviews will have spotted the obvious problem already. And the obvious problem is heterogeneity. So there is very huge differences in the impact of the intervention, both in terms of medication and symptoms, between different trials and different preparations, which is a problem. And this is why a lot of people are questioning actually whether you can lump different immunotherapy trials together and do a meta-analysis. We'll come back to that. So in terms of the guidelines, we use grade approach. Really, there is only good, robust evidence for adults for exacerbation, asthma control and safety using the house dust mite slit tablet. And so there were conditional recommendations of moderate quality evidence for that, and low quality evidence for adults and children with SCIT, subcutaneous immunotherapy, and SLIT for children. And really that is where we are, which is why we changed the title of the guideline to house dust mite driven allergic asthma. So important prerequisites: patients have to be selected, and they need to be patients who are going to respond to allergen immunotherapy, and you need to be using the right extracts and protocols. but more of that later. So these are the sorts of plots that underlie that grade guideline, with such that the evidence is in favour of using the sublingular tablet for house dust mite driven asthma, and for house dust mite subcutaneous immunotherapy for asthma. But notice that actually there are very, very few trials actually included in this analysis. Right, so what about the other guidelines? So GINA takes a completely different approach here. They use an expert panel, they look at the evidence published in the last year, and then they decide if they're going to change their guideline or not. And they did change it a few years ago based on this Resp publication from 2016. So actually, down at the bottom, there's a little symbol here that says that you can think about using sublingual immunotherapy for house dust mite driven asthma in adults and teenagers. This was a major change in terms of asthma guidelines. So what do our guidelines say? So if you remember, I'm part of the SIGN BTS asthma guideline group. I flagged up my chief investigator for this commercial pediatric house dust mite asthma trial. So I wasn't involved with this. They did ask me a few questions around interpreting trials, but I wasn't involved in actually coming to conclusions about the evidence. And so I may not necessarily agree. So the SIGN approach is, again, it's based on a systematic review and appraisal of evidence. And what they said is, yes, there are immunotherapy trials that show benefit in reducing asthma symptoms in both children and adults. They highlight, though, few studies comparing immunotherapy directly with inhaled steroids, and there is this side effect profile, particularly for subcutaneous immunotherapy. I have to say, sublingual immunotherapy is very safe. There are very few adverse events. So they felt it was difficult to know where this immunotherapy should sit, and they decided to go with their previous recommendation, which was not to recommend. And I'm going to come back to that. Actually looking at these data. So the first thing to say is not all immunotherapy products are created equally. There are huge variation in the allergen content, and this works because you are flooding the body with allergen that's driving the immune response away from the Th2. So this is phlegm P5, which is the major grass pollen allergen, and the amount in the dose of this allergen ranges from 5 to 153 micrograms. Okay, so that's a 30-fold difference. The more allergen you include in your immunotherapy protocol, the better the efficacy. So you would not want to be using one of these preparations here. You'd be wanting to use one of these model ones. Grasax is good evidence for. So that's the ones you want to be using. So this is a similar study looking at allergen content, but this is house dust with major differences in amount of allergen between preparations. In fact, in our rhinitis allergen immunotherapy product guideline, we recommended not to use these house dust mite liquid preparations because most of them just don't have enough allergen in. This is using BAT, basophil activation test, and you can see exactly the same thing. 4 allergoids, and they activate the BAT system to very, very different extents. To which products they use. So a lot of the products, particularly the old one, do not contain enough allergen to have any potential to be biologically. That probably explains most of. So older. So the other issue is that older studies use symptoms and medication use, and well, that provides a patient, the regulatory authorities and the health purchasers now want to know about exacerbations, because that's asthma attacks problem, because there are that many modern asthma immunotherapy trials. So the data pool is small. I've shown you what the data I've mentioned. A challenging endpoint because you need large numbers of participants and a long follow-up period. You'll collect a whole load of old studies, lower allergen contents, and weak study designs. So I would suggest that our guidelines at the moment are based on systematic reviews that give a very biased view of modern immunotherapy as we currently practice it. So we need to rethink our approach to immunotherapy in terms of developing clinical guidelines. Immunotherapy is not like pharmacology. So if you get two manufacturers, they produce a 5 milligram aspirin tablet. Actually, the active ingredient will be exactly the same between those two tablets. And you can lump those together. You can't lump immunotherapy together, unfortunately. So you need a product-specific approach without lumping, and then you can actually run systematic reviews and actually do meta-analysis that are going to tell you how it's going to work. So how do we use this? Now, this is now over 10 years old. This was a service evaluation we did and published, looking at what was happening at that stage. So over 220 patients, half had asthma, actually half, and a lot of them were actually on step 3 or 4, and still being safely desensitized either with subcutaneous or sublingual approach. Well, practicing immunotherapy, first of all, you need to exclude all the patients, consideration of immunotherapy. 19 out of 20 I will control with pharmacotherapy. The next thing is to know the simple 1 or 2 allergens, and that's difficult when you've got perennial symptoms. You may need to actually do an allergen challenge, either a conjunctival provocation test, or I have done bronchial provocation tests in the past. And they also need to have significant symptoms and significantly low quality of life. Otherwise, actually, the risks and benefits just don't equate. The host of allergens driving the symptoms. Decent quality of life. Other triggers may be more important. If you can't stabilize the asthma, desensitizing is likely to be associated with side effects and not a good idea. And then you've got to think about actually, can patients comply with the immunotherapy schedules? The modern ones are much easier, but sublingual immunotherapy, you are going to be taking it for a month or 2 before, say, the pollen season, all the way through the pollen season. So you may be on it for 4 or 5 months. And to me, this is very much a shared decision. The families need to know effectiveness. They need to know the potential for adverse effects. And it's a shared decision. Actually, for some families, immunotherapy is not the right thing to be doing. And even if they think it is, then there are a number of different approaches that can be used. So this is what I do most frequently. It's patients who've got symptoms from grass or tree pollen. They've normally got allergic rhinitis. Quite often, they've got asthma as well. And for teenagers, I tend to use Pollenex Quattro, 4 injections in the winter, and it works very well. And it overcomes the issue of poor adherence. Some patients prefer sublingual immunotherapy. My preference is for the tablet. It's more allergen. I've used it a lot. It works very well. Some of my colleagues prefer the liquid because you can start off with a smaller dose and titrate up, because these sublingual preparations do give you some local symptoms of itch, feeling or swelling for a few days or a few weeks, which then disappears. But they have a good safety profile, even in patients with asthma. I used to use subcutaneous immunotherapy for grass pollen and tree pollen. I've gone away from that purely because there are other better preparations around. So less frequently, I have patients with perennial symptoms, allergic rhinitis plus or minus asthma, and such that actually they're likely to benefit from immunotherapy. And this is a more of a problem area. There is a tablet which has good concentrations of allergen. There is and we have problems getting hold of the ALK tablet. We can hold of adults, not for children, but we are using it, and that works very well. And then you've got the subcutaneous immunotherapy, which again, there's good data that works well. What I wouldn't use is the sublingular liquid. As I said before, it just does not contain it. Then you've got a few other patients, and the most, the typical one is where the family are in the horse industry, they're paying the mortgage because rhinitis and asthma driven by horse dander, and it's not being controlled by conventional therapy. And that's probably the only other time I've actually used immunotherapy. So in summary, I think there's good evidence for the efficacy and safety of children for some products, with the emphasis on some, and really it's that, but actually the evidence is reasonable for other products for specific patients when there's the right benefit. Our current guidelines are biased by systematically reviewing all the studies, and I think we need to focus on the modern ones with good endpoints, good trial design, where we actually got some data. With or without asthma, driven by grass pollen, tree pollen, and possibly for some other children. So like actually avoidance is going to be impossible. So coming back to my question, there's asthma patients. There's good evidence that and would you consider
Professor Roberts, yeah. I'm just going to, your connection's getting progressively worse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop your camera so that the audio definitely comes through for people. But we can hear you perfectly well.
That's fine.
All right. I've run the poll currently, and I'm going to run it for a little longer. If you want to just do a piece, and then let me know when, and I will share you the results.
Yeah. So the problem I have is I have 3 teenagers in simul. Your kids' schools, but they're not providing mine with enough homework to keep them out of trouble at the moment. So I'm in competition, and by the look of it, I'm losing.
So Graham, about
do you want to
About
some questions while you're waiting.
Yeah, about 56% have said yes, 40% possibly. So
I think that's quite a good result. If I was giving this presentation 10% saying yes, which would probably be Eckhart and myself.
I think we might, Professor Roberts, we may need to move over to telephone audio for the
Okay.
the Q&A. Can you hear me all right? Oh, well, I suppose I can't hear you back.
Yes, I can.
Oh, you could. Jolly good.
I'm just going to find that number that I had waiting.
Yeah, so what we
Just
can
in
do
case.
is, while we're waiting for you to rejoin by telephone audio, which you can find at the bottom of the screen if you're looking for it, where it says mute, there's a little arrow next to the mute button. You click that, about 3 lines up, it'll say switch to phone audio, and that will provide you with the telephone number, the meeting ID, and the participant ID. Then once you've rejoined by telephone audio, perhaps Atul can run through some questions with you and we will share the results of the poll. How are you doing? Okay, it does look like the poll results have stopped coming through. So I'm going to end the polling, and we'll hang on for Professor Roberts to come back, I believe. Is that the right sort of thing?
Hello, right. Hopefully I'm back.
Marvellous, marvellous. Back to you, Atul.
Fantastic.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Chris. So Graham, yeah, 53% yes, 41% possibly. So 94% is yes or possibly would consider referring the patients.
So I think that's probably a very good reflection of where the data are. And I mean, I'm a practicing allergist. I'm the first to actually admit that actually we do need more trials in this area, particularly with more the modern preparations and better designs.
So Graham, a couple of questions about funding. Are there any commissioning or patient accessibility consideration for uses of AIT in the UK? And how do you address refusing funding for house dust mite sublingual immunotherapy?
Yeah, okay, so this is an issue. So I think the best way of describing immunotherapy services in the UK is to say they fly below the radar. We only desensitize a few patients every year. The volumes are not very high. They're very, I mean, the patients we desensitize, there's good reasons for that. And we are allowed to do that. There aren't any national commissioning approaches at all. It's done through local means. And I mean, in terms of cost, it's about £500 a year or so. So it's compared to biologicals, it's minimal, but still it's an appreciable amount of money. And this is why we have some challenges using some of the more modern products like Grasax and Acarazac, which are slightly more expensive. But I would argue the data for their efficacy is much better.
And is Grasax better than Olair or?
Olair doesn't have much in the way of allergen in it. So what I would suggest is anybody's using immunotherapy to go to our systematic review and actually look at the forest plots, find a study that used the product that you think you want to use or are using, and just look at the data for that product. Because there are products in use in the UK that do not contain very much allergen, and there is little or no evidence that they actually work.
Thanks, Graham. And the last one is more practical question. So once you refer the patient, I refer your patient with asthma for immunotherapy. Besides history and examination, what all tests would you do before you start immunotherapy?
Yeah, so I mean, the most important thing is the history, actually, and looking at symptoms in terms around allergen exposure. You've got to know if there's evidence of allergic sensitization, so we do skin prick testing, specific IgEs. I might do a peak flow diary. That can be quite helpful, particularly if you can get the patient away from the potential triggers. And then when I'm stuck and I don't know which of a number of perennial allergens are driving symptoms, I might go for provocation testing. I have to say that there's a number of clinics across the country now where there's an allergist running the clinic with a pediatric respiratory consultant, and those are the people to ask locally for help with these patients. And there are a lot of things we can do.
Thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you.